You've discussed before the overmedicalization of normal human behavior, and this is something I agree is quite extensive and is actually quite commonly discussed as an ethical point in clinical psychology. And yet, we don't really see much change in practitioners' approach to this problem. You still see similar rates of, say, antidepressant prescriptions in places like the United States where it's rife. Um, do you think that this is a matter of a practice being entrenched within current medical professionals, or is this due to what could be called, I'm sort of making this up, although I'm sure it's been used before, a medical industrial complex?
Yeah, it used to be argued that it's because of the medical industrial complex. I reject that. I think that
Mhm.
there's an inner drive within our culture towards the medicalization of human experience, where we are redefining what used to be called existential problems as psychological one. And I think in particular within psychology itself, there's an imperative towards a kind of concept creep where you basically find more and more sort of issues that you can create a diagnosis around. So the number of diagnoses is constantly proliferating, and the number of presentations for psychological problems is ever expanding to the point at which year on, it's almost like the more we talk about psychological problems, the more we invest in psychological resources, the more psychological problems we have. It's like an ever expanding kind of process. And in my writings, I make the point that actually uh, psychology or the medicalization side of psychology, not the scientific one, has been complicit in creating a public health problem, because I think our mental health crisis is a case of self-fulfilling prophecy. If you tell people that they are ill, then inevitably sooner or later they will feel ill.
Mhm.
And particularly if you tell young people at the age of 6, 7, 8, or 9 that they are their reaction is really a lack of attention deficit, or that they've got a variety of other kind of diagnoses, then they're going to play the part that's been assigned to them. And I
Mhm.
think that's one of the most damaging, most corrosive influences that's working away in our society.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that there's also an aspect, and I've noticed this talking to people who have been diagnosed with mental illnesses, that once you provide them with a label, they externalize it in the language that they use. And this was something that was a bit jarring to me at first, because people would say, my anxiety, or, my depression. And but they're adding a word to their own psychology there, aren't they? They're saying this is something other than me. And I think it's that they obviously feel negative emotion about their circumstances. They want to distance themselves. Their ideal self doesn't have this anxiety or this depression, and so you can sort of understand why people are susceptible to it, because they're trying to use language to sort of almost save face, if you will. But in doing so, they're also stopping themselves from taking agency. It's up to them, um, ultimately, to make the changes that will improve their situation. And I think that there's also, once you think in those terms, then a book on philosophy might have just as much healing power, if you will, as antipsychotic medication. In fact, I would say it's more healthy in some cases. I know certainly when I was a teenager, I didn't really know what the point of doing anything was at this point. I was a bit myopic. And rather than going to a therapist, I picked up French existentialist philosophy instead, which probably didn't help the problem much, but particularly reading Sartre. But um, approaching it in that way, I think, is far more healthy. And having come out the other side, I can appreciate the benefit of seeing it as a problem to be solved just by tackling it. And I think that that's something that we've moved away from as a culture, which is a bit of a shame, really.
Well, it's more than a shame, it's a tragedy,
Mm.
because when you basically adopt that kind of orientation towards life, then you basically undermine your own capacity to deal with issues. And instead of trying to cultivate your strengths, you're cultivating your weaknesses. And I think that's what sections of the medical profession are doing, and maybe not consciously, but they're making us feel fragile rather than trying to get us to look at our strengths and find out how we can be resilient in the face of a lot of difficulties. And for the future of society, we need to somehow have a paradigm shift away from the paradigm of vulnerability towards one of resilience, where we're expected to cope with things and to bounce back and to deal with disappointment and to deal with pain.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.